Hello, Assalamu alaykum. This is a previous 153 midterm. I'll just go through and explain my work for some of these problems, and InshaAllah it helps. First in, first out does not achieve good response time. For scheduling, it does not, because say you have just running Linux right now. Say I have 200 different processes running, like 50 different programs and 150 background processes. That's a very low amount. Still, even for something as basic as moving a window or resizing a window or moving my mouse, it'll still be going through all the 200 processes in the process table before moving my mouse again, which could easily lead to very bad response time. So this is true. 5.0 it does not achieve good response time. Round robin, we haven't learned multi-level feedback. Scheduling decides which waiting process to unblock first. No, because between, say you have five processes in the waiting queue, the scheduler has no say over which waiting events are unblocked. That may be decided by external devices or child processes, which will then signal to the OS that this parent process should be removed from the waiting queue. But it's not the scheduler that's deciding when to remove processes from the waiting queue. It's those external events, such as the child being terminated or the disk sending back a signal that, hey, I have your file ready. So question 2, threads and processes. These are all very important to know for the exam. The first question, process needs its own stack. This is false. Each thread also has a separate stack. If you recall one of the lecture diagrams where you would have say in the whole address space used by the process, you have the code for the whole program, and each thread has their own program counter. Say thread 1 is running function 1, thread 2 is running function 2, thread 3 is running function 3. I don't have the diagram here, but it's on one of the lecture slides. Meanwhile, each thread has their own stack memory for local variables and their own function calls, and as part of that, threads also have, alongside their own program counter, they also save the context of their own program when they're getting scheduled and paused and descheduled. Each thread has values for the processor registers that it'll back up and restore when that thread is now scheduled. So each thread has a separate stack for local variables, but all of the threads for one process, their stack is in the same address space. And a process needs its own stack, but a thread also needs its own process. So this would be false. It's more expensive to switch processes. This is true because when switching a process, you change the entire address space. You change the entire address space that you consider, rather than just the stack and the local variables when switching threads. Switching processes requires more effort in that sense. There is some more detail that may be helpful to know why switching processes is more expensive. I do remember there was more detail in the answer sheet. I can show that later, inshallah. Process has its own address space, but not a thread. Correct. Threads share the address space of the process they're part of, and both threads and processes share global variables. For this one, threads that share the same process do share global variables, but not local variables. So this would be correct for threads. Each thread for a process has its own stack, its own local variables, but the program in the heap and in static allocation also assign global variables. However, processes, two processes have completely separate heaps, static data, code, threads, they are completely separate. They only communicate via more external methods, like maybe a shared file descriptor, a network socket. Maybe network sockets they wouldn't share. I wouldn't quite know about that, but inter-process communication, other steps besides global variables, those don't work for multiple processes. And number 3, I/O requires a system call. Yes, I/O to a disk or possibly other hardware, but we've mainly learned about disks and storage so far. I/O to a disk requires syscalls for reading and writing. That's true. A fault will always cause a trap to the OS because a fault is a synchronized and unintended operation, which typically the example has been an illegal memory access, something that is, by being synchronized, caused by a program instruction, but leads to unintended behavior. Typically, illegal memory access has been the easiest example, but that will always cause a trap to the OS because this fault will cause an event and all events trap to the OS. A call to a shared library requires a system call. There was an additional answer. So a shared library between multiple processes. Call to a shared library. Right, so this is false because a shared library would usually be included at compile time. You include a math library or some output library or a class that might be shared among multiple executable files, multiple .c files, but each of them will be linked to the executable at compile time, and therefore a call to a shared library in that case will just be like calling any normal user mode function. It won't require a system call because this won't be a function in kernel memory, and the only way a system call would be caused in the case of a shared library is if that shared library itself calls a system call, but that's only an assumption. That's not necessarily the case here. Processing the race state cannot move directly to waiting state. I reviewed this earlier with you, but with Ihsan at least. Don't know if anyone else is watching this, but moving to the waiting state can only happen after the parent has run some operation that signals to the OS to put the parent in the waiting queue. So say I call the read function to disk. I'm waiting to read a file. I'm going to wait for the disk to signal back that it's ready. That will involve moving the parent to the waiting queue, and that can only happen from the running queue because we had to have run an instruction to write to disk or wait for a child to be terminated. But obviously when we're in the ready queue, we cannot run any instruction like wait, read, write that would cause us to move to the waiting queue. So this is true. And these are some race conditions. This question was a little bit unclear how it would be worded, but these are essentially knowing the four conditions for processes running code from critical sections. You need mutual exclusion. This is violated in this example because assuming the critical section is one process getting both peanut butter and jelly, each of the processes is in the critical section, whereas only one process should be in the critical section. Bounded waiting, obviously this violates that principle because if Jack is in the critical section, Jill may in this case never reach the critical section. In fact, neither will reach the critical section in this case, and therefore there's unbounded waiting. Another requirement was that if there's no thread in the critical section, a thread requesting access to the critical section cannot be stopped from entering the critical section. And perhaps that wouldn't be violated in this case, but we already have a violation with bounded waiting. And then performance, allow overhead to enter and exit the critical section. That's not as important here. Okay, I skipped question 3. We haven't learned that. And I'll do question 4. So, okay, I wrote out the code already. For part A, you can draw out the process tree line by line. So here I make a tuple of the count PID1, PID2, which will exist in all 4 processes. And where is my note? Okay, so this like S symbol just means that there can be a long wait in that section, because say over here in x0 at this waiting point, the scheduler schedules x1, x2, x3, all the other processes, they run to completion, and then finally we're done with the waiting on x0 and we finally print 1, in this case print 1 after our wait. So that's just the diagram. 4 total processes will be created. If you look at which processes call fork, x0 will call fork once, x0 will call fork once, and then x1 will also call fork in the next if condition. X2 will call fork in the last if condition. Last if condition, just make sure, yeah. And then x3 never calls fork because it resumed execution at right after line 11, returning the value of 0 because it's the child process, and that's how fork operates. And then after that, x3 immediately goes to either the if condition or the print statement, depending which question you're answering. But 4 total processes created. For B, a process tree like this one will be very important for one of the questions. Code explain the possible outputs. So one way you can explain this, I believe, is at every process, say for x1, print 1, this print 1 has to come before print 2, print 1 in x2 has to come before print 3, and in terms of any interleaving, you would only have to worry about cases like in x2, print 1 has to come before anything in x3 is printed, because x3 is only forked after x2's first print statement. And then list 2 examples. Know all of the ordering rules that have to happen. So like I said, in this case, print 1 in x2 has to come before forking to x3, so therefore print 1 has to come before either of the print 3s in this case, and also print 1 has to come before print 2 and x1. So those are the 2 bare minimum rules for this problem, what order things will print in. Now say we uncomment this waiting code. Now thankfully this problem is a little bit easier in that x0 is the only thread that will have a non-zero PID1 value, so it's the only one that will run this wait PID condition, wait PID function, and the value of PID1 here represents the process ID of x1. So what this wait PID function is saying is, for x0, wait until PID1 has, I believe, has terminated. Until x1 has terminated. So because of that, we can say x1's print1 and print2 statements have to execute before print1, and you can say from that we need to print 2 before we print the 1 at the end of x0. Therefore, a string like this is not possible with this wait condition, because we print 2 only after we print 2 only after all of the ones in the program have been printed, including the print 1 at the end of x0, which would not happen if, say, the wait condition is in this portion of our process tree. We have to execute our print 2 before x0 resumes and prints 1. So this output would not be possible. And though that is all of the material on here that's relevant for exam 1, understanding how to use a process tree, understanding the different types of events would also be important. It would be very helpful. And a little bit of under the hood knowledge of how forking works, what the wait function does exactly. You could say the wait function requires the current thread to wait until all of its children, or wait until any of its children have been terminated if you call wait with no parameters. But yeah, other than that, and inshallah this was helpful, and inshallah you do well on your exam, and also that I can make a better and sooner practice exam video for exam 2. Semaphores and synchronization, and inshallah memory management will be fun. That'll be interesting. All right. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.